Okay, this is the online lesson guide for Chapter 3. So the state is defined as the political, economic, social form of human organization, and it serves to maintain order, protect it from external threat, and administer to collective needs of its people. So this state is the primary actor and decision maker in the global system, which we at times call an anarchic system. Now, what does it mean when we say anarchic in this term? It doesn't mean that we're talking about total chaos. In this case, anarchy simply means that there's no global governance to enforce the rules. There's no global president. There's no world congress. There's not even a world federation like Captain Kirk had in Star Trek to go out and explore new worlds. So what we have here is the states interact according to their own self-interest as needed, and that brings up the concept of sovereignty, a very important concept in the global system. Once you have been recognized as a state by all of the other states and by the international organizations, the state, your state, has the final authority to make your own decision and make your own decisions and conduct your own affairs. So this is very important because this rule of sovereignty is really the only hard and fast rule we have out in the global system, as you'll see when we start talking about international law and how it has to rely on states actually agreeing that this global or international law will have to be abided by. But the states can technically do whatever they want in their own territories, and if somebody violates another state's sovereignty, that's really the only major rule that there is in the global system. That's a consensus where the other states say, well, that's our only rule, so to speak, and shouldn't be violating that. Now let's talk a few minutes about how this modern state system evolved, because this system of states that we have in the world is relatively recent phenomenon that has developed. So let's go all the way back to 10,000 years ago, when, most importantly, the concept of agriculture came about. The innovation that resulted in the domestication of plants and animals was probably one of the single most important events to human civilization. The advent of agriculture enabled people to come together in larger and larger communities and stay in one place and plan their future and create businesses and special roles and governments and bureaucracies. And so agriculture really kind of led to the concept of human civilization as we know it today. Very important. So human community starts to persist over time because they can stay and grow. Now, prior to that, we were roving bands of hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. And so this really kind of kick-started human civilization into the next level. And so as a result, we started to see patterns of organization from these human communities. We started to see laws because people had to live together and coexist, so they had to come up with laws in order to live together. They started to come up with certain rights like property rights, so that because people had to live together and people had to live in their own spaces, so they had to come up with some rules for that. They started to develop market systems or some sort of system that they could trade or barter or be able to transact. And so they also came up with structures of villages and eventually towns and cities. So these are the forerunners of our modern institutions. So as we focus on the Western European region in particular, around 1,000 years AD or 1,000 years in the Common Era, we can start focusing on the Western European region as to where these institutions were starting to take shape. The court systems, the trial systems, jury trials, the estate managers that would run the property, the record keeping that was the forerunner of bureaucratic processes and tax collecting, and we start to see multi-ethnic empires start to form in these regions that were run by popes and kings and nobles. If you go all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, that set a lot of the standards for property rights that would come after that, as well as the kind of the foundation for councils that evolved into the Parliament in Great Britain. So this is a era where these institutions were forming, but also they were forming under a feudal system where you would have multi-ethnic empires run by these kings and emperors, and then they would delegate the landowners or the nobles to pretty much control the working population, which consisted of peasants and serfs. So life was nasty, brutish, and short, as we said earlier. That Hobbes quote from Hobbes up until this time. So what set the stage for a modern state to evolve? And that would be the decline of this feudal system, which we can kind of narrow down. We're going to focus again on the Western European region because that's where the first modern states formed that set the standard for the states that we have today. So this 200-year period, thereabouts, there were some things that occurred here that resulted in the decline of this feudal system, which then set the tone for the modern state. Now, interestingly or ironically, you could say that the Black Plague at this and around this period in the 1300s, which wiped out as much as 75% of the population in some regions in this area, well, the plague was instrumental in increasing the value of labor because the workers became scarce because they had been wiped out by this plague. So therefore, the workers had more leverage in order to get more rights, get a little bit more for their labor. And so that kind of also took a little bit of power from the nobles in that they needed this labor. And so that gave the workers a little bit more leverage. And also around this time, we start to see innovations in technology, production, and agriculture that started to result in trade. We started to see some major trade routes in this area. We started to see earlier forms of mass production. We started to see defense technologies such as gunpowder and cannons, which were more conducive to protecting a defined territory as opposed to these large multi-ethnic expansive empires where in many cases they were conquered on horseback over large areas and then were very scattered. And so now with trade, mass production, defense technology, we start to see that it's more conducive to have a defined area to do this with. And as a result of this innovation in agriculture, productive techniques, defense technology, we started to see that the merchant class or the business class started to take power away from the nobles. They started to supersede the nobles, and we started to see a system to where the merchant class or the business class was given a little bit more priority, and we started to see the beginnings of the capitalist systems here as far as currencies being used to buy products, that sort of thing. So another part of the factor there. And so all of this combined, we start to see during this period as feudalism declines, we start to see a shift to what we call territorially defined authority. And particularly in the Western European region, they started to fragment along their cultural lines. The Brits, the Huns, the Huguenots, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, the Belgians, the Danish. We started to see about a dozen cultural groups fracture off into these territorially defined authorities where not only did they politically fragment, but they also kind of went into considerably more political competition, which then really kicked their development into overdrive as well. So let's look at the next phase. Once the feudalist system starts to crumble and decline, we start to see again in Western European over these next 300 years, we start to see increased political competition, which really they were competing for ideas, they were competing for innovation, they were competing for technology, they were competing for power in this Western European region. And as a result, we saw the Renaissance period come through this area. We started to see scientific inquiry. And unfortunately, we also saw lots of war in this region because they were competing, and that also potentially influences conflict. So by the end of the Hundred Years' War, we see the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which was very instrumental in establishing this concept of sovereignty that we've just talked about. The concept of sovereignty was established in this treaty in the Western European region so that these modern states could agree to take care of their own business, basically. And what we have here is, now that you are recognized as a sovereign territory, here we are seeing the modern state really starting to come to form here. Now we see citizens. Now we have borders that define our territory, where we have resources that we can get out of these borders, and we have citizens within these borders that we're going to protect. And importantly, we see that the loyalty of the average human shifts from things like religion or family or tribes or clans. That loyalty starts to shift to this new territorially defined authority that will be called the state, and they give this state the moral authority to protect these institutions that have been forming for centuries, these courts, these trial by juries, these property rights and laws, and record keeping and tax collecting. So now the citizens are shifting their loyalty to this state to protect these institutions, protect us, just like Hobbes said, protect us, we'll sacrifice a little bit of our freedom in order to let this state protect us and perhaps even dominate us for our own good. And then we start to see the important concept of a national identity start to form, which bonds future generations in these regions. So now we have the national identity of the French or the Brits or the Germans or the Danish. And then these areas that are now solidifying into the modern state, they literally dominate the rest of the world. And again, there's the concept of sovereignty, which is a very important concept in the global system. Now, once the European states became so powerful, then you could argue they dominated the rest of the world because they could, and that for that first 300-year period, from 1500 to 1800, we have what is typically called the period of colonization. And this is where these states would form or delegate these joint stock companies, which is the forerunner to our modern corporations, such as the Dutch East Indies Company that dominated Indonesia region and all those islands out there for all the resources, and the British East Indies Company, which literally ran the productive effort out of the early colonies of the United States, as well as controlled India for a long time. So what these new Western states were doing were delegating these joint stock companies to go out and extract the resources that they needed to become wealthy and utilize their labor, perhaps even forced labor or very cheap labor of the natives in these regions in order to extract these resources of minerals and spices and gold and silver, to support the concept of mercantilism, which we'll talk about more later, which literally is a state-run economic system that literally is driven to create wealth for the state, particularly in terms of gold and silver and products, luxury products, sugar, spices, and silk and things like that they can exploit it because they can. They have the power to do that. They're able to sail across the ocean and exploit the resources of other peoples and other regions. And so after about 300 years, this colonization through these joint stock corporations started to get bureaucratic and unwieldy and corrupt and inefficient. So what these Western states did is shift gears a little bit, and from around 1800 or so up until around World War II, these Western European states like Great Britain and France and Denmark and Belgium, Spain by this time had already kind of moved out of South America, but again, South America had already been exploited and had already been dominated, and even to this day, the elite elements of the culture of South America are Spanish descendants, and the indigenous people are typically the lower class of people. So what these Western states then, in order to shift gears to take responsibility away from these corrupt joint stock corporations, is now let's just take control of these colonies. Let's just make them part of our empire. So therefore, the bulk of Africa and the bulk of the Middle East, much of Eastern Asia, or I guess just to say Eastern Europe, where they became literally subjects of the colonial empire. And the states would then appoint royal governors to run that colony. And the same thing, of course, would occur to exploit their labor and extract resources as needed to serve the empire. And this colonialism started to fall apart by World War II. Great Britain had been losing power prior to World War II. The concept of granting independence became more and more acceptable, and by the 1960s, most of the African states had been granted independence. But as we see to this very day, the legacy of colonialism has led to certain political cultures that are very hard to overcome with corruption and inefficiency and instability. Even to this day, the former colonial subjects were socialized for several centuries into these political cultures that are very difficult to get out of. Now, just to give you an idea of how powerful these Western European states were once they started dominating the world through colonization and colonialism, by the early 20th century, these dozen or so, barely a dozen Western states controlled almost 3/4 of the entire global economy. And just to give you an example, here's the British Empire, pretty much at its peak there around World War I. You can see how many areas that were controlled by the British Empire at that time. And that doesn't even include the colonies, 13 colonies in the United States that granted their independence by 1776. But you can see all the Western European states in this region, right in here in this area, controlled considerable areas of the world during this period of colonization and colonialism. But this state system stayed in place, and there's several reasons why. It became a more effective and a more efficient organization for several things. It became more efficient for extracting resources in your territory, and then you can trade those resources to add to your wealth, or you can use those resources to build your own industries. And as a result, you have a more efficient organization for economic relations. You are in charge of your territory, in charge of your monetary system, your tax system, and so therefore it's a lot more efficient to manage your economic relations. You have a better organization for monopoly of your armed forces within your controlled territory to protect your territory with these armed forces. It's also more conducive for elite norms of your society to take charge and start to influence your society through the institutions that the elite norms are created through, such as in America, we create the Constitution and lots of other systems of government that we all agree to abide by. And so therefore you start to develop a civil society within your borders, and therefore the state system begins to solidify in every other region in the world in order to interact with the states that are already in place. Everybody, all territories all human societies then start to form their own states. And this state system effectively delegitimized all other forms of governance to this day. Now, we have some problems, obviously, and we'll talk about those. Now, more on the civil society of any state. A civil society gives and accepts the government's authority to act on its behalf. Now, in some states, this is more unstable than others. In some states, you have dictators running the show, and the civil society doesn't have a whole lot of choice, and so therefore their civil society is not as well matured. And that's a very important aspect of a successful, stable state, is to have a healthy civil society, and that includes religious organizations of all different types of religions, hobby groups, political movements that are able to organize and influence government or even speak out against government, professional associations that get people together in their own interest to help their livelihood and then also influence government so that the government recognizes their profession in order for them to make a living in this very healthy, vibrant civil society. And particularly in America and other states that are very stable and successful, relatively speaking, the civil society is partially independent of the state. It somewhat balances with the state. We'll talk about this more in detail later when we talk about a democratic political culture, because it also has tensions with the state to make sure that the state is held accountable, to keep the state on its toes. We trust you because we are electing you into that position, but we are also suspicious of you because you have the potential to be secretive or gather power. And so therefore you have somewhat of a balance of a trust in government along with a healthy skepticism of government. Very hard to establish, very hard to evolve into. That's why a lot of countries in the world are still struggling with development and stability because of these situations where they're unable to create a stable state system that's going to allow a healthy civil society to flourish. So as we'll see, the civil society is necessary for a healthy functioning of democratic systems. Now let's talk for the next few minutes about what the basic challenges are to this state system. Now let's be clear, this state system that we have is probably not going anywhere for a long time. We'll talk a little bit about some theories that are examining how states could be willing to give up their sovereignty and form perhaps a global system or a global federation. We don't really see that. We actually see as much opposition to that as we do a tendency to go in that direction. Certainly arguable either way, but let's talk about the challenges that this state system has facing it. Now, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that our system remains anarchic, and that there's no global authority that's keeping all of these states in line. The states are acting upon their own self-interest, and that is still conducive to conflict, competition, which is not, of course, always bad, but competition could lead to problems as well. And of course, we do see a lot of inequality in the world that is really not getting alleviated as long as we see states that are still out for their own self-interest. And since we have no global governance, resolution remains difficult. Even though we have world courts that are trying to get states to come together and resolve their differences through an international law, that's still very difficult because the states can still decide whether or not they want to abide by that international decision. And if they decide that they don't want to abide by it, then it's effectively useless. We also see that authoritarian states have a tendency to abuse their own citizens. There's lots of cases still out there in the world where there's citizens that don't like their authoritarian rulers and are thrown in political prisons or driven out and become refugees. We'll talk about some of those examples as we go through the course. Another thing that the state system is having to deal with is that states may be increasingly unable to serve the interests of the people because of the fact that the state has got so many other things that it's dealing with for its own survival or to maintain its power base. Now, this concept of utilitarianism is one that simply means that the utilitarian concept is that we are trying to find the greatest benefit that is going to help the greatest number of people. And you could argue that that was one of the original ideas of a government, is to everybody collectively decide how can we benefit the greatest number of our citizens. Now, you certainly could see that states in the world, even the United States, is considerably less utilitarian than it may have been originally intended, because we have the power elite and the wealthy that is driving policy that continues to give them advantages, while the poor or the working man or even the middle class is not seeing as much benefits as the power elites or the wealthy are getting from government. And government is divided into parties that are constantly battling for control of government. So therefore, governments are becoming more disconnected from people, and they are divided from within because of these parties that are always jockeying for control of government so that they can pass policy that they believe in, or that they can make the world, they can shape the world in what they think the world should be according to their ideology. And the United States is witnessing that right now with our two-party system, constantly bickering between the parties as to who's going to control Congress, who's going to control the courts, who's going to control the presidency. And if we start to see increasingly smaller states because of fracturing, that we'll talk about here in just a second, they are going to be increasingly dependent on larger states, which is pretty much defeating the purpose of the state system if you're creating states that really can't even handle their own business. Another challenge to the state system is that we're starting to see more and more global concerns that really are not going to be able to get solved unless we solve them globally as a collective system of states coming together to try to determine how do we stop this disease. Because when disease gets to a border, it doesn't just stop there and say, oh, okay, I got to get a passport to go to this other country. No, the disease just keeps on going and affects people all over the world. A person just has to get on a plane, and that disease is spread all the way across the other side of the world. Concerns about poverty are crossing borders. We have lots of non-governmental organizations that are trying to address poverty that the states are unable to deal with because the poverty is so large and so big, and it crosses borders. And obviously we know that the environment, whether it's pollution or even greenhouse gases that is contributing to the global warming, those are global issues that have to be solved collectively on a global basis. We're also starting to see that there's more economic interdependence between states because of trade, the global and financial system of investment. We do see that the rich countries are having to give aid to poor countries to help them develop. We'll talk more about aid later because it is somewhat controversial as far as whether the poor countries are getting enough, or from the other perspective that whether rich countries should be giving any money at all to poor countries. Very strong debate going on the concept of aid, but that's a global concern, because if we have poor countries that are constantly needing help and they're constantly underdeveloped or breeding grounds for terrorism, that is affecting all states. That's affecting rich states. So that's a global concern. And what we're starting to see, in order to deal with these global concerns, we're going to have to delegate more and more of these situations to international organizations like the UN, perhaps the World Bank, which serves to provide loans and aid to poor countries for developing their water systems, their infrastructure, the International Monetary Fund, which also provides loans and regulates their financial systems to help keep them stable, particularly with their currencies. The European Union, we'll talk about in more detail later, which is the type of organization that's trying to get states together in order to increase their economic power and to solve problems collectively. EU is going through some trying times right now, and we'll talk about those later. But as you can see, another big challenge to the state system is that we're seeing more and more global concerns. Now, the concept of a nation state is where a culture of peoples, basically defined along ethnic lines. Ethnicity is where people are bound by common language, common religions, common historical experiences, or common customs, that sort of thing. And it binds people together very strongly. And cultures of people would generally prefer to have a state that matches their culture. Well, that's not how it worked with colonialism. A lot of these regions were carved up with borders that had no really consideration of cultural elements. And so, therefore, you've got a lot of countries out there that remain unstable because these cultural elements cannot get along or cannot coexist. And so, this concept of ethno-nationalism means that these ethnic groups would like to have their own country. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this could, well, it has shown to create more conflict. So this concept of ethno-nationalism is that the state boundaries do not coincide with the culturally homogeneous populations that they would prefer. Now, this is very debatable because if everybody just divided up according to their own ethnicity of people that they agreed with or looked like or sounded like or believed like, yes, we would have a lot of separated territories with potentially more conflict. Whereas when you look at some of the examples of democratic systems, you have fairly diverse societies that agree to coexist and agree to come together and represent their various groups in government, and they are relatively successful without having to break apart in these various different states or countries just because they want to be ethnically homogenous. So this is a very controversial and debatable concept. So the nationalism of having your own country feeds this right that we need a state that matches our culture or our ethnicity. And this is a source of much conflict in the world. And technically, there's really no such thing as a pure nation state that exists out there in the world. We have a lot of states out there that are relatively homogeneous, but there's enough elements in there that continue to create conflict or separatist movements or self-determination. So this is where it gets debatable because the United States was formed on this theory of self-determination. We wanted to break away from Great Britain and determine our own future, and that is part of the motivation for a lot of these regions. But of course, separatist movements are also just wanting to break away from a country where the government is not treating them right, does not recognize them, or perhaps is even oppressing them or ostracizing them. So those are some of the major challenges that the state system that we still have today, and it will be here for a long time, that it's facing. So we've talked about these things. These are some concepts that you're going to want to know and prepare for before you take the quiz. What are those terms? What's the basic factors that led to the decline of the feudal system? What are the definitions of these two terms and why are they important? What does that term utilitarian mean in the context of state governments? And in the term we just talked about, ethno-nationalism, how would you briefly describe that?